I remember when I was just getting into gardening, how confused I was, how overwhelmed I was with all of the information out there. And one question I always remember asking is, how long is this going to take me? So I feel like if you're just getting into gardening, that is such a common question that you probably will be asking and may not have the answer for. So of course, there's no perfect size for everyone, but there are some general recommendations that I can give you, and that's what I want to spend some time doing today in this video. I want to tell you about different sizes of gardens and how long they might take you to take care of them. And this is not just my own opinion. I did actually ask dozens of other gardeners all around the world, mostly on Facebook. I asked them how long does it take to take care of their garden, and what size is it, what skill level are they, and all that kind of stuff. So it's not just my opinion. I do have tons of other people's feedback and recommendations as well that I want to share with you in this video. You don't want to get into something that you can't handle, something that you can't manage. So it's really helpful to at least have a general idea of what kind of time commitment you're making when you start getting into gardening and you start sort of planning it out and deciding how big you want to go. Hey, Nadia here, and today we are going to talk about figuring out what size garden is going to be best for you. So when we're thinking about what size garden is going to be right for you, there's a couple things to factor in before we start talking about the actual amount of time it's going to take for the different sizes of gardens. And this is actually the response that I usually hear, and it's the response that I heard when I was just getting started. I heard things like, start small, or it can take as long as you want it to take, or it depends. Now, I agree with that, but I feel like that's not super helpful, right? I agree that there are definitely factors that influence how long it's going to take you, and I'm going to talk a little bit about those before I actually jump into the times. But I feel like that's not super helpful. When you're just getting into growing, or you're just getting into gardening, having someone say to you, it depends, is not always the most helpful piece of advice. So I agree with what they're saying, that it actually truly does depend on a lot of different factors, and I'm going to talk about those. But there is still ranges. There's still some sort of recommendation that you can have to kind of know what you're going to get yourself into. All right, now before we get into actually talking about different sizes and times, I want you to first sort of think about the question, how much time do you have now that you can commit? Because that's obviously going to be a huge factor, right, in deciding how much time or how big you want your garden to be, is how much time do you have. So you may think, you have half an hour a few times a week, maybe an hour on the weekends. So you'd have on average 2.5 hours a week. Or you might say, I have 5 or 10 hours a week to spend in my garden. So I want you to first think about how much time you have, because that's going to help dictate what size it should be. But also know that it takes different amounts of time at different times of the year. So usually in the spring and the fall, it takes longer to care for a garden. So factor that in when we're talking about timeline. Know that typically in the spring, because you're going to be planting, you're going to be maybe preparing your garden, adding some compost, you're going to be spending more time in the spring prepping everything, and then more time in the fall harvesting, and then sort of tidying up the beds, so like pulling out plants and stuff like that. I got that response from everyone, so I definitely want to say that first, is that know that I'm talking about summer months. So I'm talking about not the like few weeks in the spring and the fall where you might be spending more time. These times are going to be in the middle. So just think about that when you're sort of gauging which size might work for you. And then the other thing is really, how much do you want to be able to eat from your garden? So I'm talking more so about like growing food. So growing vegetables, herbs, maybe fruits, if you want to get into that, edible flowers. I love growing edible flowers. So how much do you actually want to be able to eat from your garden? Because if you just want some herbs to be able to add to your dishes, maybe a tomato plant to be able to have some fresh tomatoes in the summer, that's very different from someone who says, no, I want to actually be more self-sustainable. I want to be able to not have to rely on going to the grocery store or going to the farmer's market and things like that. So kind of knowing where you stand in terms of what's your objective here? Are you trying to get a big chunk of your food from your garden? Or is it something that you're just trying to experiment with and just have some fun with? Because that's also going to dictate it. You don't want to go too big if your goal isn't really to be more self-sufficient. Before we actually get into the times, I just want to make a quick note that there are definitely some things that might influence how long it's going to take you. And I want to touch on those briefly before I actually give you some time so that you kind of have a gauge on whether you're going to be on the low end of the scale or the high end of the scale. So the first thing that's definitely going to impact how long it's going to take you is how fast you work in the garden or how fast you do whatever it is you need to do in the garden. And I'll tell you, so I am very slow and methodical when I spend time in the garden. I will see a bird flying by and I'll just kind of watch it and see what it's doing and sort of follow its path. And then I'll see a spider web and I'll just, be in amazement for a few seconds and just watch it and look at it. Like, I just kind of do other things other than actually doing the task at hand in the garden. And I love that. I love that side of gardening. So if you are like that and you tend to kind of just want to be there and sort of soak up being outside and being in nature, then know that it's probably going to take you a little bit longer than someone like my husband. My husband is the opposite of me. He sees gardening as like a form of exercise, essentially. So he works so fast and he can work up a sweat in the garden. And I mean, you might be thinking, how is that possible? But it is. And if you work quickly and you go through everything really, really fast, then naturally it's going to be, you can have a larger garden than someone who works slowly with the same amount of time. So that's, when you think about it that way, it's pretty obvious, but you might not have thought of that. Just how fast you naturally work and how fast you naturally do things like weeding or watering or harvesting, whatever it is you're going to be doing in the garden. So that's the first thing. The other factor that can influence how long it's going to take you is the types of things that you're growing. So if you are typically growing easy to handle or easy to manage plants, then it's naturally going to take less time to care for them. And I always like to use the term honor nature. So honoring nature really means that you're planting things that naturally do well where you live. So there's no list that works for everyone in every part of the world. It's literally where you live, what types of plants naturally grow well where you are. So the more that you kind of focus on plants in that circle, the easier and faster it's gonna be for you. And then the farther you go away from that, if you kind of look at it as a scale, the more difficult it's going to be to handle it. So if you grow something that naturally has a lot of pest issues or naturally, you live in a dry climate and you grow something that needs a lot of water, you're going to be doing more to care for that plant than if you grew something that was easy in your climate. So know that the types of things that you're growing can definitely have a factor in terms of how long it's going to take you. And then the last thing is really just your soil, your kind of climate. Like, is your soil really good and easy to work with? Is it full of weeds, or do you have a pretty weed-free area? Like, there's a lot of things that are just about your particular garden that can also influence how long it's going to take. So I just wanted to say that so you have that as a reference point before I actually get into the sizes of gardens and then the time, which is what I'm going to do right now. If you are a beginner and you have, let's say, an hour or two a week to spend on your garden, then I would recommend you start with something like 2 or 3 raised beds, or anywhere between 50 square feet and 100 square feet. So some people like to grow in raised beds and some people like to have like a plot where they kind of grow in rows or in areas within that sort of section in the ground, whichever way. So I think that's a really comfortable range. And if you're, I'll have the meters as well in the the blog post so that you have a reference if you don't go by feet. I understand some of our European friends don't go by feet, so I'll have both in the blog. I just don't know them off all by heart. So I think that's a really comfortable range. So 1 or 2 hours a week, anywhere between 50 and 250 square feet, or just 2, 3, 4 maybe raised beds. That's a really comfortable starting point, and I think that that's very manageable in the sort of 2 hours a week range. And now I want to give you some real life examples from other gardeners. So I told you that I had asked a bunch of other growers for their advice. So Michelle has said, I have a tiny yard, it's about 20 by 30 feet, all garden with a path. She has vegetables, berry bushes, perennials, flowers. She has some raspberries, cherries, a grapevine. She considers herself to be an intermediate grower. And she says, like I mentioned, most time is spent in the spring prepping the soil. After that, I can get away with 1 or 2 hours a week. So she waters for 15 minutes or so a day, depending on the weather. Of course, if it's raining, you wouldn't need to water. And then certainly when it's drier, like in the heat of the summer, if you go through drought periods, you might need to water a little bit more as well. So she has a big garden. I mean, 20 by 30 feet is about 600 feet, right? But she does have perennials and things and paths and gates and stuff like that. So even if we cut it in half and we say she has 300 feet of garden space, she can do that in 2 hours a day. So that's definitely, that's even above what I'm saying, 350 to 250 square feet. I feel like that's a good number to start with though, 50 to 250. I wouldn't necessarily start this big because she probably works faster. That's a pretty big garden to be able to do in 2 hours a week. So, and then another example here is Daryl. So Daryl has a garden that's about 15 by 25 feet. And he says he spends about 2 hours a week weeding and watering, which is really the main two things that you do in the middle of the growing season. And then in the spring, he spends about a day and a half prepping the soil and planting. And then in the fall, maybe more like an hour a day for the weeks in the fall when he's harvesting everything. He grows mostly vegetables. And he does say, the amazing thing is you can make it longer or shorter with good results. That's really true. So you don't have to spend as much time in the garden, but you can, and you typically would get better results if you keep your plants weed free. They're typically going to respond better to stress. So if there's pests, because they're kind of growing and they're doing their thing, if they're being strangled or if they're being stripped of nutrients or water, then they're going to be harder to take care of because you're going to have all sorts of other issues. This is a really good example of, yeah, he has a pretty decent sized garden, 15 by 25 feet, and he spends 2 hours a week in the summer to take care of it. So when you're just getting started out, I still think that it's really good to start with that 50 to 250 kind of square foot range, because that way you're not setting yourself for something that's too big for you, and you can get a sense of really how long it's going to take you to be able to take care of it. On the smaller side would probably be if you're a little bit nervous, or if it's just you, that if you live by yourself, maybe you don't need a bigger garden. But if you have a family, 250 square feet, and you're ready to take on that kind of challenge, I think that's a nice size to start with. And then into the next category of sizing, I would put it into the sort of 300 to 700 square foot range. So 300 if you're slower, kind of more methodical grower like me, 700 if you tend to move quickly through the garden. That's anywhere from 90 to 215 meters, I checked. So I can give you a range if you go based on meters. And for this size, I think it would take you anywhere between 3 to 5 hours a week. That's a pretty comfortable range. 3 hours if you work pretty fast, or if you're on the smaller side of that scale, and then more like 5 hours if you're higher, like 700 or even just a little bit above 700. So I want to give you a real life example of this one. So Brenda says, my veggie garden is around 750 square feet, plus we have a berry patch, 4 apple trees, 2 plum trees, and a pear tree. She talks about spring being the busiest time, getting everything ready, getting veggie cages and things like that in place. Then it's about 4 hours a week through the summer, and then it gets a little bit busier again in the fall. So I think that's a pretty good example of what you can look at. So she has a vegetable garden plus those trees. Now trees naturally are going to take up a little bit more space, but they don't necessarily, it's not equal, right? So a tree could be really big, but if you don't have to do anything, like I have a mulberry tree, it's huge, but I do nothing to this mulberry tree to take care of it because it grows really well naturally here. But I might also have an apple tree that I'd have to spray because apples don't grow really well here. That's a pretty good example. I think she's doing a lot in 4 hours a week. I feel like that's a pretty good sized garden when you consider the vegetable garden plus the trees, to be able to do that in 4 hours a week. But it's definitely doable. You can see right here that it's doable. So I think if you're in that sort of 3 to 5 hours a week, sticking or at least starting with a garden that's anywhere between 300 and 700 square feet, I feel like that's a pretty good starting point for you if that's the kind of time commitment you're looking for. And then Lauren spends anywhere from 1 to 6 hours a week. So that's a pretty big range. I would imagine it's going to be not very often 1 hour a week. Maybe if she's kind of just not doing a whole lot that week. But again, she's saying depending on availability, rainfall, time of season. So let's kind of split it in the middle and say 3 hours a week, which would fall right into this time frame. She has a narrow bed along her front path with some flowers and pollinator gardens. So flowers that are going to bring beneficial insects to help out the rest of her garden. And 25 by 15 foot vegetable garden in the back. So she says she's a beginner gardener and that works for her. So I love that size. That's right inside of our sort of 300 to 700 range. And I think that's totally doable. So really different size of garden than Brenda have. They both have very different sizes of garden, but they're taking almost the same amount of time. So you can see there's definitely a scale in there, but I do feel like this is a good starting point for you. If you have anywhere from 3 to 5 hours a week that you can commit pretty much every week, then having a garden 300 to 700 square feet is probably going to be a good starting point for you. And now let's scale up and say that you want a bigger garden or you have more time. Let's say you have 6 to 10 hours a week. So this is the third category, 6 to 10 hours a week. Anywhere between 800 to 1200 feet would be a really nice amount for that. So we're getting bigger. I mean, this is a commitment. If you have 6 to 10 hours a week, that's a lot of time. If you have a family or if you have other hobbies, maybe your kids are in soccer or whatever. If you have other hobbies, committing to 6 to 10 hours a week is a lot of time. So decide for sure that this is the direction that you want to go before you go here. If you do, awesome. You're going to have a pretty kick-ass garden. Okay, so Pat gave us an example. She says that in the spring and summer, she spends at least 6 hours or more in her week gardening. Her garden is the size of her lot minus her house, which is 132 by 50 feet, and her house is 1,200 square feet. She gave some examples of the different areas of her garden, but she has a vegetable garden, 20 by 60 foot vegetable garden, and she has trees. She has plums, apricots, berries, things like that. So I kind of did the math, and it looks like she was in around the 1,200, so at the high end of this scale, and she's doing it in 6 hours or more a week. So definitely doable. If you want to get into growing things like fruit trees, if you want to get into growing berries, plus have a really big vegetable garden, I would say you need to have at least 6 hours a week. And then remember that it's going to take you a little bit longer in the spring and the fall. And I just want to say too here, when you get into the really bigger gardens, you're probably going to be preserving some of your food in the fall, unless you just give it all away. And preserving can mean canning. So if you like to make tomato sauce or if you like to make jams and stuff like that, it can mean drying or dehydrating, one of my favorites. I love dehydrating things. And it can mean freezing. So that's another one of my favorites. I don't actually do much canning. I'm not a big fan of canning, but drying and freezing take less time, but they still take time. So you want to consider it's not just the time in your garden. The bigger your garden is, especially when we get into growing food, you have to also consider in the fall that it's going to take you more time to to do something with all the food, especially if it all comes, like if you have an apple tree, you're gonna have bushels and bushels and bushels of apples that you need to do something with. So either you put them in storage if you happen to have storage for them, like a cold room or something like that. Otherwise, you gotta do something with it, or else all of your beautiful apples are gonna go to waste. You can also donate them or give them to friends too. So that's a really good example from Pat. Now Melissa, she has a vegetable garden, 20 by 40 feet. So she has 800 square feet of a vegetable garden. And she's a beginner, so it's a pretty ambitious garden, I think, if you're a beginner. She says she spends a couple full days each week for the first few weeks, and after that, it's about an hour or so a day. So let's say she spends an hour a day, that's 7 hours a week. That's right in our range. So those are two examples of people who are making it work for them in this size of garden space and how long it's going to take them. All right, now we're into our last group, and this is the people who love their gardens. And I love this group. I have a special place in my heart for these people because they have committed their lives to their garden. So, and I'm talking like the last size for a home gardener. Obviously, there's if you have a farm, you would be way above this category. But if you have a home and maybe you have a homestead, maybe you're trying to really make a dent in your grocery bill, maybe you're trying to eat all of your own food or 80% of your own food from your own garden, at least in the spring, summer, fall kind of seasons, then you're going to be in this category. And this is anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000 square feet, or 300 to 600 meters. And in this group, I think you need at least 11 hours, but more closer, maybe up to 20 hours a week. So we're talking like part-time job kind of hours, right? 20 hours a week, that's a part-time job. And this is for people who even though I'm super gung-ho, I probably wouldn't start here. This is a big commitment. So you probably can't work full-time and handle this size of garden. Unless you work at home and you can kind of be really flexible with your schedule. But if you have other hobbies, if you have kids, and they're not doing anything with you in the garden, if you're just doing this yourself, you have to really commit to this size of garden. So I have an example here from Heather. She says, I've gardened organically for 50 years, so that's very cool. Mainly perennial flowers, shrubs, and trees. We downsized our home and garden 3 years ago. And she's built her forever home. She put in some pictures, it's gorgeous. She says she has 6 areas, each about 10 by 25 feet. She loves gardening. She doesn't consider it work. She spends at least a few hours in her garden every single day. So I did the math, and that's about 1,500 feet. So it's right in the middle of the range. And if we say a few hours a day, let's say 2 hours a day, that's 14 hours a week that she would be spending in her garden for a 1,500 square foot garden. So that's doable. That's totally inside of this range. I think if you are going to go to this scale though, you really have to commit to it and you really have to love it and know that it's something that you want to commit to long term, because you can definitely create a garden and then scale it back. Like you can turn it back into lawn, you can turn it into a patio, you can do lots of things. You don't have to commit to it for life, but it's a lot harder when you tear apart your whole lawn, right, to bring it back than it is to just take a small area that you kind of experimented to start with. And then Robin replied and said, we have a city lot and she just recently bought the vacant lot beside them. So that's awesome. And combined has a little over an acre. And then she says that because the soil on her vacant lot was not very good, she constructed 12 4-foot by 12-foot raised beds. So that's very cool. So 12 raised beds, that's a lot. And then also put in a small 9-tree orchard. So this sounds amazing to think about, like a whole lot just dedicated to your garden. So she has fruit trees, pawpaws, black currants, blueberries, kiwis, raspberries, grapes, rhubarb. And then she also put in 6 more raised beds, 4-foot by 32 feet. She has an asparagus bed. She has a raspberry hedge. So huge, right? This is a big garden. This is a huge time commitment. So this is more like a homesteader kind of person who wants to eat mostly out of her own garden. I would imagine she can get most, if not all, of her food from her garden. Now, she might need to bring in some things that she can't grow, like she's from Ontario, so she, like maybe she wants lemons or something like that to buy, but that's a pretty sizable garden. So she says that she spends right now about 4 hours a day, but she is putting in an irrigation system, which is going to knock about an hour a day. So if we say 3 hours a day, 7 days a week, that's 21 hours. So that's right at the top of this range, but that's a lot of time commitment. When you think about 20 and right now, almost 30 hours a week that she's spending on her garden. So know that that is how long it might take you if you want to have a huge garden like that, with an orchard, with berry trees, with perennial vegetables. If you want a huge garden like that, you are looking at 15, 20, maybe more hours a week. And she also, of course, says, in the fall is when it's so busy harvesting, pickling, freezing, canning, like I said, but that's the best part of the season as far as she's concerned. So I love that. I love that she's super enthusiastic about it. And that's something I really want you to make sure that you remember, right? Because when you're thinking about creating a garden, or when you're thinking about scaling up your garden, remember that this is supposed to be fun. Now, maybe you're doing this because you need to. Maybe it's for financial reasons, and that's totally different. If that's the case, then do whatever you have to do. But if you are growing a garden and you're thinking, I want to do this because I love it, like the responses that I'm getting from people, you can tell, you can hear in how they're talking about it, how much they love their garden and how much they love to spend time in it. So remember that when you are deciding what size is going to be best for you and how much time you want to spend, that you want to be able to love that time that you're spending outside. And remember that there's so many benefits that you might not even think about today in terms of what you get out of having a garden. But as soon as it starts to become a chore, as soon as it becomes something that you kind of dread doing, or you think, oh, I can't possibly take care of this garden, I don't have time for it, I'm having all these problems. As soon as you kind of get to that point, revisit it, because that's no fun, right? You don't have a hobby that you hate doing, right? My other hobby is golf, and I never go out golfing and think, oh, I can't believe I have to go golfing again. Like, I don't think that. I'm super excited about when I get to go golfing, and I'm also super excited about when I get to go to my garden. As long as it's within the time frame that works for me, that works for my life at this stage in my life, then I think I'm going to be doing all right. So remember that, look back at some of the other factors that I talked about earlier as far as some of the things that might influence how much time it takes. Like maybe you need to grow different things, or maybe you need to scale it back to kind of your speed of working. So there's so much that factors in. I just want you to remember that this is supposed to be fun. This is supposed to be a hobby that you love to do, and try to find a size that works for you and that you feel great about. So I hope this video was helpful. I do have some other things that might help you if you want help designing your garden. There's going to be some links down below with as well as some other videos that you might be interested in watching. So if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, subscribe to my channel. And that is it for this week, and I will see you in the next one.